Good evening, everybody.
Good
Hello.
evening.
I'm
Good
very
evening, sis.
I'm very sorry again. You know me and the technology, right? I think you have gotten accustomed to it now. Okay. So um I am still fudging my way around it. Hopefully by the end of December I will get through it. But bear with me. We are going to have such a good time that I'm telling you. I apologize for being so late. It's never a good thing to go beyond the time that you say you would start. But as I said, you know how the technology is these days, right? Anyway, we are together again, and I hope you had a good day, and I hope you are enjoying the meetings that we're having, despite the fact that sometimes I'm a little late because of my technology. Um, and we have a lot more to come. And I'm hoping that at the end of December, I don't know what will happen at the end of December. If the Lord says, keep going, then I'll keep going. If not, then we will just give up this wonderful little gathering at the end of December, right? But let us see what the Lord has planned, right? As usual, I like to do a little housekeeping. Thank you. I like to do a little housekeeping. And I like to first of all invite the Lord's presence. Thank you very much. And Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for another moment in your presence, your awesome presence. We just want to thank you, Father, for just being the mighty God that is the all wise, all powerful, all knowing God that has given us such wisdom and has given us such education and has given us such experiences so that we can educate each other and help each other to grow and to be more like you. Father, I just thank you that we have the opportunity to share in this way with each other. Just help us to enjoy what we have and help us, Father, to be educated completely and solidly through these little meetings. Make a plan, Lord, I ask, at the end of this, so that at the end of December, we will know what to do come January. We do everything according to your will and your way. In Jesus' name, amen. So now I want to say, as usual, I want to extend welcome to every individual that is here. Um, One of the things I want to say is that I'm happy for, well, I know there are a lot of individuals who are always here, but incidentally, there are always visitors, and I'm very happy for the individuals who visit. And I hope that the individuals who are inviting new people that or new people will also invite other people so we can have a good time, enjoy ourselves, and continue. All right. Like I said, I am waiting for the Lord to tell me what will happen at the end of, well, what do I say now? At the end of the year, so that we can understand what we need to do. No, I got a few pictures from a few persons, some updates right here. I got a few pictures. Oh, where's my phone? Um I got a few pictures. I think I got but the funny thing is that I only saw the pictures this evening and I wasn't able to get them in. So guess what's gonna happen? I am going to have to send them. I'm going to have to do the pictures for next week, um, so that we can have our usual wonderful sharing and showing, right? Oh yes, Sister Wallen, I saw your butter. Oh, that was so fantastic. When did you make your butter? Today?
No, it's a surprise from last week.
Ah, how nice. And you've used it already?
Oh, yes, I even shared it with my mama. Yeah.
You see what I'm telling you? And wasn't it
Mm.
wonderful?
Oh, yes, it's good, good, good. But you know what? When I tasted it, I said, if I knew, I would have put some garlic in it and let it taste like garlic butter.
Yeah, well, you can make another version of your butter and make some
Yes, man.
garlic.
When I'm gonna make again, I'm gonna put it in there.
And listen, you are not, tell me that you are not inspired to go to the supermarket and buy any more butter, right?
No, 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 no. The thing is that I never used to use butter, as a matter of fact,
Yeah.
because of my condition.
Yes.
I don't use it.
Well, let me
But
tell you the
because
way.
I made this one now,
Yes.
I am able to use it.
You see what I'm talking about, man? And this is healthy, probiotic, full packed, healthy butter that you can add. Listen, this butter is not, it's not just tasty, it's healthy. You
Yeah.
understand? And you see, your food, your food must not only fill fill you up, but it must also heal your body,
Oh
right?
yes. Yeah.
So I am hoping that I will be able to show this entire group your your butter. I think it is so delightful, you know?
It's great, man.
Yes, and it tastes wonderful, doesn't it?
Oh yes, especially with that virgin coconut oil. Oh
Oh,
wow.
I tell you. And you
Yeah.
can put it on your sandwich and put it in all of your food. You don't have to go back to the supermarket and buy
Not,
any
not
butter
at
anymore.
all. Not at
And it
all. Not at
lasts
all.
it and you can freeze it. It lasts as long as just like any other butter.
Oh
Just
yes.
like the butter with all the other fandangles in it. All right. So today I really want to do something. I got a number of requests and I got a number of emails and WhatsApp this week about how I want to make bread. How do I really do it and do it professionally and do it properly so that I can at least be able to bake my weekly bread and not have to worry that it's going to be insane. I'm not going to have something. I'm going to waste my time and it's going to. All right. So this week I am looking completely at giving you the tips so that you can go home. And I'm going to give you I think I've given you a bread recipe before. I may have. I think it was pumpkin bread.
Yes, the pumpkin bread.
All right. And Sister Wallen, you made the pumpkin bread and it was so delightful, wasn't it?
Oh, oh
Ah,
yes, oh yes.
so today, all of today, I made lentil sprouted bread, and I'm gonna share it with you tonight. But I think I will give you that recipe. All right. But whatever it is, I want to do bread making tonight because the commercial bread that we buy are very unhealthy, and I cannot go into the details. They are absolutely unhealthy. If we are going to preserve our bodies, and especially, that I have set out to talk to people, to people who have gone through cancer, people who are going through it now, people who have recovered and who just want to prevent and maintain and continue. And if you are going to keep on being healthy, you have one of the things that you have to do is learn to make your own bread, because there are a lot of things in commercial breads that are not healthy for you. They can actually make your condition worse. All right. Okay. So now I just wanted to do bread making today, right? And as a matter of fact, I'm asking you, when we are done with this session, I'm asking that next week, as many people as possible, please try to make a bread. I'll give you a recipe. Please try to make a bread and send me on my WhatsApp so we can share it together in this group, so that I know that at least you are understanding and you are getting ahead with some of these healthy principles that we are working on, right? So first of all, I want to look at the different types of bread. We have bread can fall into a number of categories, right? The most common ones are gluten-based, and those gluten-based breads are breads that are made from wheat or wheat derivatives. So you have grains and grains that are from the wheat family. So you have things like spelt, you have things like barley, you have, and then you have, of course, the bulgur wheat, right? So you have those breads, gluten breads. Then you have gluten free, and gluten free breads are breads that are made from things like rice, potato, um, other seeds. Maybe you have almond flour, nut flour, seed flour, other grains that do not come from the wheat family. No, you have um breads that are yeasted breads, and these are breads that you have to these are you add they have 4 different types of yeast that you can add. Additionally, you can make your own at home, but for the purpose of today, we are talking about we are going to just use instant yeast, quick rise instant yeast. So you can find it in any one of your grocery stores. So you can use the yeast, and that will give you the leavening and the rising and that lightness that you need. You also have yeast free, but for yeast free breads, you can use an alternative. Some folks use eggs. If you use eggs, I am promoting a whole food plant-based diet, so I would not say use eggs. I would say use your flaxseed or your chia seed eggs, because you're going to get the same bounce if you are on the same rice. You can use things if you're making some kind of sweet bread. You can use things like ripe bananas, and then you can grind it into your mix. um and you can use you can also use um things like baking powder and baking soda. Those aluminum baking powder that is aluminum free, and baking soda you can combine. It's about a 25%. So if you use 2 teaspoons of baking powder, you use 25% of that. You add a little baking soda, right? But you don't really have to add the baking soda. You can just have non-aluminum baking powder, and you make your bread, and you combine it with your dried portion, and then you do your mix, your wet portion, and combine, and then you still have a nice rise, because it's like making a muffin or making a cake with baking powder, right? Then you have flatbreads. Um, Flatbreads are usually unleavened breads. So for the purpose of for the purpose just for the purpose of today, things like the communion bread. I don't expect us to make communion bread every day to eat. But I'm just saying things like communion bread, that's unleavened bread. It is made with things like olive oil. Some in some cultures, like Mediterranean and some parts of the Indian culture, they use this flatbread, but and they use the oil, or some people use a little shortening, and you spread it as you would a roti. As a matter of fact, a roti is a type of bread, but it is also an unleavened bread, right? It is more the roti is more of a quick bread, right? So the quick bread is just something that you may or may not use some leavening agent, and it's something that you don't have to go and wait for 35 minutes to bake. You can actually do stovetop bread, and you can actually bake just yeast bread, and those kinds. You can also make them on the stovetop. You don't have to put them in the oven. Another day we will look at that. All right. All right, so we want to look at the bread dictionary. Some things that you have to be acquainted with, some words when you are doing your bread at home. And this is really a crash course in bread making, right? Because I want you to be able to develop your skills in baking bread so that you can do it at home. And let me tell you, it is such a wonderful, delightful feeling when you come home and you bake your own bread and you take it out of the oven, you put it on the rack to cool, and then your family is just slicing their own homemade bread. It's absolutely the most delightful feeling. Today I made a lot of um sprouted lentil bread for my family, and there's a number of folks who have ordered bread, so I had to be making the breads that I have to deliver in the morning. And let me tell you, I made the sprouted bread for the orders, but incidentally I made three breads for my house, three sprouted breads for my house. And by the time this evening came, one of the bread was done. It is just an overwhelmingly good feeling just to know that this was something that was baked in your kitchen. It's just absolutely fantastic. And that is why I'm happy that so many people sent me their WhatsApp and sent me their emails to say, please, can you talk about, is it possible for you to talk about bread making? And I'm happy that I'm able to do it. All right. So one of the most important things that we want to that word in the bread dictionary is proofing. And you hear it all the time loosely, but listen, proofing is simply when you make the dough, when you've added the yeast and you have made it into a dough, made the flour and the mix and everything into a dough, and you have done your kneading. So you knead it at least for 7 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes if you're making a yeast bread. If you're making a bread with that does not have gluten, um, sorry, not a yeast bread. Well, it's a yeast and gluten. So, because what it does is that it balances the yeast, but it also helps the gluten to it helps to condition the gluten, right? These days, they have in commercial breads, they use something called dough conditioner. And that, my friends, we won't get go. I don't want to go into the details of it, but what I can tell you is that the dough conditioner is a very unhealthy thing that research has shown that many dough conditioners are made from the proteins in human hair. So let us not go into there. So what the best thing for us to do, and sometimes it is also some of them, a lot of the things are made from things that the Bible talks about that we should not put in our bodies. So the best thing for us to do is to learn to make it in our own kitchen. That's the best way to keep our bodies clean. So proofing is now, as I said, when you have made the dough, when you have added your yeast, when you have done your kneading, what you have to let the dough rest. So when you have done all of that, just place a little oil in the bowl that you have your dough in, and just rub the oil over the dough and cover it, put it into a warm place. We'll talk about a proofing where you can what how you can do the proofing and create your own little proof basket. We will talk about that a little later on. What I usually do is I sometimes I put a bowl with a little warm water in the bottom of my oven, and then I put the bowl with the bread that I want with the dough. I I cover it with a towel or so. I kind of damp the towel a little bit, and I cover it, and I put it on the top layer, the top shelf of the oven, and I put the warm water on the bottom. And that warm water helps the whole process, and it usually doubles its size in no time. Sometimes it triples because the warmth is beautiful for it, right? So in other words, right here, as you see, it allows the dough to rest and rise to develop the strength and quality of the end product, right? um it also aids the fermentation, and this is really where the yeast cells in the leavened doughs consume the carbohydrates and expel the carbon dioxide gas that causes the dough to expand or to rise. So, in other words, when you put it down to rest, because remember, you put the yeast, but you have to place sugar in the dough so that the yeast can actually eat the sugar, and then that chemical process begins. So what that process is basically a type of fermentation. When the yeast is, when you put the dough to rest. So the fermentation now, what it does during that process is that the the yeast the yeast cells literally is eating up the sugar, and because of course you know that's some kind of carbs, and and then what happens now is that a whole gas is formed, and then it is expelled, right? And when this happens, that is why you see the dough rising and becoming lighter, and you see these little air bubbles and that kind of thing. It's basically a very complex chemical action and reaction that happens in this whole fermentation, that causes, in this whole process of resting and proofing, that causes the bread to give you that rise. All right. And if you do not proof if you don't proof proof the dough, there's no point in baking the bread, right? You're gonna get one big clump of hard rock stone. I'm telling you. All right. Okay, so let's look at some of the tips that we can think about for a successful bread. Now, the first thing you have to do is to know the recipe that you are going to make. The recipe for the bread you're going to make. There's no point in wandering into bread making and you don't have a recipe and you don't. Well, first of all, if you are, for example, myself, I don't have to look now and to read a book because I've been making bread so long, and I know it so well that I just go into my kitchen and I know. But you see, it comes with experience and thing in this whole process. So I really don't have to write down a recipe now unless it's something that I'm really it's really new to me, or I'm trying somebody else's recipe. I go into my kitchen and I have one single recipe for a bread base, especially if it's a gluten bread. And I make that base and I make every other bread that comes from it. If it's a gluten-free bread, which is the bread that I would make for myself personally because I am gluten sensitive. I the recipes will change eons of times because sometimes I just want to be adventurous, but I just make something. I just go and I think about it. But in all fairness, when you are the breads that generally that are not gluten free, I mean, I just have one base and I make everything else from that, right? So, importantly, know the recipe. Read if you have to bake with recipe, especially if you are not an expert or if you are just learning. Um, know know what you're doing. Read and know what you're doing because you can end up with a big blob of flour, and you can also you can see different things happening with the dough, and you don't understand, and you might think you've spoiled it, and you might very well spoil it. You know what I mean? So you have to really know and understand what it is. And there are different actions and reactions that happen during the bread making process that you really have to understand, right? Try a simple recipe. I'm going to give you a very simple recipe tonight. When I say a simple, I mean an absolute simple. And that recipe is the recipe I personally use as my bread base every single time at my house. I make my molasses bread. I'm going to give you that recipe tonight, okay? And now a lot of people, I have to bake bread now for a lot of people who call and order their bread. And I use that same bread base. And then I add whatever else, with different types of stuff, grains and stuff that I'm doing. All right. So if I'm making sweet bread, if I'm making what you call it, cinnamon roll, if I'm whatever I'm making, I use it as a pizza dough, whatever it is that I'm making, I have one bread base, right? So you have to know how to balance the temperatures when you're doing your bread. If the area is too hot, it can kill the yeast. If it is too cold, the yeast will not grow well. So you have to be careful of what you're doing. No, I think I made an error here. The salt and heat, it shouldn't be yeast. Salt and heat retard yeast growth. So when you're baking your bread, if you put the yeast at one corner of the bowl in the flour, don't put the salt at that same corner. Put it on the opposite corner, because the salt will actually kill the yeast. And if you have to use lukewarm water. And if you are using the water that is too hot, it will also retard the growth of the yeast. All right. So be aware of that. Thoroughly develop the gluten by beating or kneading. Usually there's a saying that says you have to give your bread dough 200 strokes in order for you to get a good dough and to get a good bread. And that is, if you really look at it, because you have to knead and knead and knead. And you can do it with your mixer if you have a mixer. I personally love to feel the dough, so I like to do it with my hands on my counter. But these days I'm getting a little up in age, so I'm using my mixer more. But if you are going to use your mixer, you have to knead it from the outer edges in, and you do that for about 7 minutes, right? If you Sorry, the mixer for 7 minutes. If you're going to knead it outer in with your hands, you can do it for about 10 minutes. All right? Because you have to develop the gluten, right? If not, you're going to get one hard bread that you can't even chew. All right. So another tip is that you must allow the dough to sit its course. And when I say that, I mean allow the dough, don't cut the dough rising or the dough proofing time too short. Give it an up to an hour, right? If you use lukewarm water, use it, give it the time so that it can rise on its own and do its thing. So, and at least get to a place where it's double in the size. When it gets to double the size, then it is ready for baking. And another thing is, when I'm doing my bread, you get a lighter bread depending on the number of times you allow the dough to run its course. So for me, before I put my bread in the oven, I take up to 2.5, 3 hours. You know why? I allow it to rise once in the bowl. Then I I get out the air. I knead it and take out the air. Then I cut it into portions and I put it into the different baking dishes. Baking pans. When I put it into the baking pan, I cover it and put it back so that I allow it to rise again. When it does that, I take it out sometimes, if it depending on how light I want the bread and depending on the type of bread I'm making, I let it rise a third time. But a first and a second time will give you a beautiful, soft, moist, light bread. So um you could try that when you are doing your baking, right? And I allow it to rise for up to an hour or a few minutes after, but you can't overproof it. So don't let it rise for 3 hours and 4 hours, because you are just going to get a bread that falls, right? And also sometimes they can get a little. There are different actions. We will go into it when we're talking about overproofing. Now, when you look for the indentation mark when it's ready. When you're doing your bread, if you put your finger in it and it jumps back at you, it means that it means that you have not completed the kneading process. When it is ready for baking, or when it is ready for proofing, when you finish the kneading, when you put your finger on the dough, it should make an indentation, meaning it should make a little hole and don't come back at you. If it comes back at you, spring back at you, it means that you need to go kneading again for at least another 7 minutes, right? So, um, one of the things I like to do with my bread, and I always get a really nice brown crust, is if I have honey, I use a little honey and water. And before I put it in the oven, I brush it lightly with a little honey and water. Also, one of the things I like to do too is to use a little soy milk with a little honey, and then I just brush it lightly, and it gets a really nice brown but soft crust. Um, Sometimes too, I use a little oil, you know, and I brush lightly over it, because of course not too heavy with the oil, because if you are too heavy with the oil, you'll end up getting a fried bread crust, right? And it will be very hard in no time. So just brush it so you get a nice tender crust. I find that this works, but when you make cinnamon rolls and you brush them, you brush the dough with a little honey water or oil, or so it gets nice and crispy. It's so beautiful on the outside. It's fantastic. You see, baking is just amazing, I'm telling you. No, this is one of the tips that I use, and I'm telling you, it's fantastic. A little soy or chickpea flour. If you are adding 5 cups of flour, add a quarter cup of soy flour or a quarter cup of chickpea flour to your bread. And what this does is that it gives you it sort of helps to hold the moisture, so you get a really nice moist bread when you're done baking it. And you bake your bread for anywhere from 35 minutes to 60 minutes, right? I'm sorry. Okay. Now, what are some of the common defects when you're making your bread? I'm going to tell you what the defects can be, and why we end up with this sometimes. Sometimes when you're done making your bread, you have a sour taste. Sour. The reason is that sometimes you have too high a temperature on the bread. You allow it to proof for too long, so it's literally spoils the process. And then of course you have sometimes poor yeast. Not all the yeast, sometimes the yeast is old and things, so it doesn't work, and it just brings about a bad taste in your bread. Now, another common defect is that your bread may be dry, right? And when this is so, is that you may put too much flour. I'm sorry. Sometimes when you put too much flour in the bread, that is why I mentioned you have to know your recipe, right? So if I'm making one single loaf of bread, no, I don't use more than 3 cups, 2.5 to 3 cups of flour. I might need an extra half cup for when I'm kneading, if it may be too wet, right? But I don't use more than, say, 3 cups of flour. Now, if your bread is too dry, you might have too much flour, or you over bake it. You can let it stay in the oven. I mean, you don't need to make a bread that has to stay in the oven for 2 hours. You don't need that at all. Unless you are steam baking your bread, because if you put a bread in there and you put some hot water in one of those baking pans, and you set your bread in there because you don't want it to burn on the bottom. You have to let it stay there for a long period. If your bread is too heavy, it means that you have not done sufficient kneading. Your flour or yeast may be old, or you may have put too much liquid. So the outside is dry, but the inside isn't, right? Sometimes when you have cracks in the bread, it's that the oven is too hot for what it is at. So if you need to regularly, you bake your bread for about 35 to 45 minutes at about 300 to 350 degrees, right? That will give you a decent enough bread. If you find that you stick a toothpick in it and it's still gummy on the inside, all you have to do is turn down the oven and give it another 20 to 25 minutes, right? Now, sometimes this is something, dark patches. Did I say thick crust? Sometimes when you have too thick a crust, is that you have added too much salt and you have baked it so much that the crust becomes a little hard. Sometimes there's too much heat on the bread, and so the bottom will become um so much harder than what you really need. So the crust is really what is right around the bread. Sometimes you have dark patches in the bread, and that's because the materials that are used are inferior. And you see, when you're making bread, especially when you're doing it at home, you have to have the finest whole food, whole grains, and healthy, and you just have to have good materials, right? Please excuse me. Um, no, when you have sogginess is similar to heaviness. You have too much liquid. Sometimes what happens is that when you bake your bread, you have an airtight container and you lock the hot bread in that because you want to cool it, right? Now that is a crazy no-no. Sometimes also when you remove the bread from the oven and it is still in the baking pan, if you cover it there or just leave it there to cool, what will happen is that it will get soggy because it will be sweating literally in the baking pan on the counter. So the right thing to do is to turn it out of the bread pan, turn it onto a tea towel, or better yet, get a bread rack, one of those little metal bread racks, and you just turn down the bread on it and cover it with a tea towel, and it cools nicely in a couple of hours, right? Sometimes when you get an ill-shaped loaf, it's because you have not sufficiently done the proofing. So the proofing has been cut too short. And sometimes too, what happens is that the bread pan is too large for the little bit of thing that you put in there, for that the little dough that you put in there. So when you're baking, it goes all over the place, right? Sometimes too you put there is too much of the dough or the actual bread mix. There's too much of it in the pan. The pan is too small, it's a big amount. So you have to judge and weigh, which is why it's important to start small if you're not a professional. Start in the simple way. Now, very rarely have I ever had grainy bread. I can't remember ever having grainy bread. But grainy bread is when you have too much liquid, you have mixed it properly, and then the heat, the oven is insufficient warm. So, I don't remember ever having grainy bread, but I still am telling you so that you can look for it. You might be fortunate enough to get a grainy bread, right? All right, so let's the dictionary. We have to remember these things and know what these things are if we are going to make our bread, right? So we talked about this fermentation earlier, where the we have the breakdown of the energy containing compounds such as carbohydrates into carbon dioxide And this is because of an enzyme reaction, an enzyme action that gives up, and that breaks down. And so we get the rise of the bread, right? The proofing yeast, right? We talked about that. Dissolving active yeast in warm, lukewarm water to rehydrate. Also, and this is also called blooming. Proofing, by the way, when you are doing the yeast, when you're baking bread, it's best to use a little lukewarm water. It's best to use lukewarm water when you're doing the yeast. You can do one of two things. And I personally don't like this method that I'm going to tell you right now, which is when you pour the water and the yeast and the sugar into a container and you let it bubble and then you pour it into the bread. I personally don't like that, right? You can do it if you feel comfortable. You know what I do when I'm doing my bread? I put everything together. I put the yeast in the dry part of my bread and I mix them up thoroughly with along with the sugar, the salt, and the flour, and I mix it up well. Then I use a little lukewarm water along with, and I mix it with the molasses and the coconut oil. Or sometimes I use a little coconut. I use coconut milk. When you do that, it gives you this beautiful moist. Oh, I love that. A rich taste in your bread. And I also add cinnamon or cardamom, no, or cardamom or coriander to the dry mix. Sometimes I add nutmeg because of so that I can develop on the taste, right? And it works out beautifully. Sometimes I tell you when I'm making the bread at home, sometimes I add even vanilla, and it's just delightful. So what I do basically is just, as I said, I don't like putting the yeast in that. I just put it in the dry mix and I do it. And listen, if you have room temperature water as well, or room temperature milk, not milk, you can just put it in there, but it's going to take a longer time to proof. If you don't use the warm water, it's going to take a much longer time to proof, right? So it's best to just use. And when I say warm water, I mean water that you can bathe the baby in. Warm water, lukewarm, right? Now, there is something called autolyse, which is allowing the dough to rest after the flour and water are mixed, allowing the flour and the water, when you have mixed those together, you allow them to rest. This is something that is specialized. This is a specialized baking technique that is used. We don't use that in our regions here. You use that, people like the French people and those people, they use these kind of things a lot, right? So we don't mix the flour and the water before we put the yeast in there. We Well, I suppose some people will do it because they would allow the yeast and the water and the sugar to rise separately than they put that before they put it in. I personally don't do it that way because I don't like it, right? Now, bulk fermentation is when this is the first resting period after the yeast has been added and before you shape the dough. You remember I told you that you can you can allow the dough to rest about 2 or 3 times. This is where we are talking. The first resting period, when you have completed the thing, added the yeast, done your kneading, and you're allowing it the first rise, right? This is what you call bulk fermentation. So you after this first rise, you bunk out the air, and then you allow it, put it, you shape it by, some people wait. I don't bother to wait because I'm doing it at home. If I'm doing it for somebody that orders a bread, which people do, then I have to make sure that the portions are right, because I have to make sure if they order a 1 pound bread, I have to make sure that I put enough for a 1 pound bread in the bread pan, right? But if I'm doing it at home, I don't bother to wait. We just cut portions and we bake, right? So, but really having a little scale in your kitchen, right? And weighing at the end of the time when you've done your first proofing, and you want to know how much now. You want to sometimes too, when you have a set portion, you and in your bread pan, you get a consistent size and a consistent weight and a consistent general loaf, right? As I said to you, I only do those fancy things when I am when people are ordering bread, which they do. If I'm just baking for my house, we are comfortable. So not that I don't want to give them the best, but I they are not going to be squeamish if I make a 2 pound bread, a loaf, or a 1 pound, because it's going to disappear anytime soon, right? They just want healthy, wholesome bread. All right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to hurry along a little bit. So overproofing is another thing word we have to remember in the bread dictionary. If we have proofed it too long, remember earlier I said don't proof your bread up to 3 hours. Don't proof your bread up to 4 hours. You don't need that, right? Because what happens is that the bread is allowed to proof up to about an hour. You have what is called air bubbles in it, and that is what gives it this lightness, right? And when you allow them to go beyond 3 hours and 4 hours, what happens is that those air bubbles just break, and your bread just flops and drops. And what happens after that is that even when you bake it, you just get this floppy bread. You understand? So it's best not to overproof, right? So to help you with the overproofing, just press down on the dough to remove the gas, and then reshape and reproof your bread, right? Which means press when it flops, you just use your fingers, your 4 fingers, and sort of thump it like that to get rid of the air, and then you just make it into a log if you like, or make it into a circle if you're making a round bread, and then you just put it again so it can proof, but probably 30 to 40 minutes, right? That will help you. Underproofing means that you have not allowed the dough to rest enough, right? Remember we talked about sticking your finger and it bouncing back, right? No, retarding. Remember we talked about earlier. I talked about retardation, meaning you place the dough in an area where it's very chill, very cold, and it slows down the activity of the yeast. So if you want to slow down the activity of the yeast, stick it into the refrigerator. When it gets into the refrigerator at about say 4 to 6 degrees centigrade, you can always look on your timer. Once you put it in that cold environment, the yeast action is going to slow down, right? So and when the yeast activity slows down, that is what we call retarding yeast activity, right? Now, the a proofer, we talked about that. A proofer means something that you can put your dough, your bread dough, your bread mix in, really, so that the yeast will grow and make that carbon dioxide release, expel that gas, and you get those nice light bubbles so that you can get it right. So you can have a proofing oven, and these things are sold, or a proofing cabinet. These things are commercial bakeries will have these, and they are actually homemade ones that you can use. But for me personally, I don't have a proofer. I just use, as I said, I put some warm water in a bowl, put it in the bottom of my oven, and then I put the bowl with the bread that is proofing on the top, and I cover it with a tea towel, which is a little damp, and I get the best one. Sometimes it rises 2 to 3 times, more. I mean, 3 to 4 times the original size, right? But these are excellent things because they are great kitchen helpers, I can tell you. So you have a dough proof and your proofing drawer, or you have your proof basket, or you have your proof box too, right? And all you have to do is put these. It's just a warm area, as I said before. You can maximize your proofing by just putting it into this warm, still area where, I mean, nothing disturbs it. And it's usually about 70 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, right? You can make your own proofing box. See, I told you that is what I use. Place the bread on the rack above and keep the oven door closed. Don't turn on the heat on the oven. The hot water will keep the closer. This is basically my way of my proofing box, really, right? So I proof my loaf by using a little, and sometimes too, depending on how warm it is on the outside, I don't need to use that bowl in the bottom of the oven, right? But it's a great way because I always find that I get 3 or 4 times the size if I use this method of proofing, right? So the proofing basket, as I mentioned, um, it's just a one of those fancy baskets that's made from some kind of fancy material, right? And it's sometimes used. It's a soft material. I don't know is if sometimes it's made from the some polished cane skin. It's also bamboo. It's also made from bamboo too. So that it's one of those expensive fancy things that it's nice if you want to have it, but it's nice to fancy up your kitchen with it. But I mean, you have simpler ways that you don't have to spend a penny for. And you always have to remember the word yeast when you are baking. Unless you are making a yeast free, you still need to remember a leavening agent, which may be baking powder, right? And by the way, your yeast is just what, well, they call it a fungus. The and it's just something that is used to promote fermentation, right? We mentioned earlier the instant yeast. It may come as an active dry yeast, or it may just come as fresh yeast. And one of these days I'll show you how to make fresh yeast at home, right? Just making it from feeding it a couple of times, feeding flour and water for a couple of days until you get yeast that is just as crazy as the instant yeast, right? Now, when you're baking bread, remember this. If you're saying room temperature, you're talking about 75 degrees. If you're talking about cold proof, you're talking about 50 to 58 degrees, right? Um, and temperatures are important when you're making bread. Okay. Now I have to show you. These are the breads that I made for my house today. These are sprouted bread. If you notice, a part of the bread is square and the top is kind of round. I got some really new what you call it, silicone baking bread pans. And I don't know, they just seem to be so soft and flimsy. I can barely, I put a little bread in them. By the time they were done proofing, the thing was all over the place. I had to now put one silicone basket into pan into another, and that was how I ended up getting my bread. But anyway, nonetheless, I'm quite happy with this one. So I'm showing you my weekly bakings, which is my sprouted lentil bread. This is actually one of my favorite. This can actually be made gluten free, or you can make it with the regular flour, right? But this is it. Okay. Now I want to show you, these are the baking cans that I'm talking about. If you notice, they're going all over the place. They're so soft. I have other silicone baking pans that are so nice and firm. These are so soft, and oh my lord, I have to go hunt for it. I normally bake in glass containers, glass baking dishes. This one to the far right. My normal dish is a glass baking dish, a glass parrot. That's what I bake in normally. I have about 7 or 8 of them in my kitchen, because sometimes I get enough orders for bread on a Friday to cover that. So I have that. And I like to bake in the glass because the warmth of the glass helps the bread, and it doesn't burn very easily in it. And secondly, too, the bread is always easier to handle when you use it. Now, these are the ones I want to show you, the different stages. Now, this is actually the second proofing, right? And this is at the beginning of the second proofing, right? So we just went through getting them from the bowl and punching out the air, and then we have shaped them now and placed them in each one of these, right? Now, if you notice, these are these are in line. We took it from the start. If you notice, all of them have risen. This is after about half an hour in the baking dishes now. And if you notice, they have risen way above the top of the lid, the top of the baking pan. That is now we are going through the second rise. All right. But this one is when we just get in, we are just shaping it. All right. And we are going to cover this now with a tea towel and put it back into the oven in that warm place. This now is when we have done that, and we have allowed it to proof again and to rest again for another 30 minutes. I think this was about 25 or 30 minutes later, and it has gotten up to this, right? So this is literally the stages of your proofing. Okay. This again, this again is 20 minutes afterwards, 20 minutes after the first proofing. Sorry, after the second proofing, 20 minutes, right? It is still rising. All right. This now I wanted to show you the way we talked about sometimes the bread gets out of shape and all that. This is what is happening here, because the bread pan is, although we put enough bread material to suit the size of the pan, it was the bread pan was a soft silicone, so it seemed a little inferior, right? So it's soft, so soft that as soon as the bread starts rising and doing its thing, it's out of shape. So I wanted to show you that. Look especially on this red one and this gray one, right? Now look at this. Look at what we end up with. You notice what we have ended up with? The top of it is round and the bottom of it is square, because it has taken the shape of the the silicone baking sheet and baking pans, and these are inferior because it's not. Remember, we talked about some of the reasons why we can have some dilemmas. This is also one of them, and I wanted you to see this for your own self, right? So the bread that I showed you at the beginning are these breads, because these breads they went all out of shape because of the container. So that is my little discourse on bread making tonight. I want to say thanks to you all for visiting. I want to first of all and always say thanks to the Lord for the wisdom, and I thank him too for his presence and always being here with us so we can edify each other. I thank all the visitors who came tonight. I don't know everybody who is here, but I thank you for coming, and I hope that you will come again and continue to come. I want to start doing so. I got about six. I got about six um, emails. Sorry, WhatsApps um, between Tuesday and today, and the requests were for individuals asking me if I can do some of the things, the vegan version of the Christmas specials that you normally do. I can very well do that. You can send in the chat right now and let me know if we can do that. As a rule, I don't celebrate Christmas, and that is from a religious perspective and personally for me. I normally get very anxious when it comes around to these holidays. So I generally don't. I just want to be with my family and just keep a quiet, low keyed time, and that makes me happy. But there are individuals who get together, and there are things you want to make in your own homes that is that reflects some of the Christmas turkey and all that kind of thing. So now if that is agreeable with individuals, I will make some vegan versions of some of the foods that people normally eat at Christmas time. I know you normally eat pot roast. I know you normally eat something like turkey. I know you normally eat things like Christmas cakes and all kinds of things, little things like those. Later on down, I'm going to go into just doing 1 hour of just those specials, right? You can look forward to that for sure. I have started working ever since I got the emails, the WhatsApps. I started working on putting them together, right? So I will probably just do a nice little special that you can enjoy and you can make too and have fun despite COVID, right? You can also have that. You can live. I also want to say thanks to all the regular members, to Abby and to Dr. Abby and to Dr. Curtis and Dr. Abby. And I want to say a very big thank you to my dear little technician, Gabs, the general. All right. My super technician who never leaves me and never fails me, right?